I don't see our scripture reader, so I'm going to, I know this passage. It comes from the book of Exodus, where we are learning all the great Bible stories everybody should know. And I'll be beginning with the first verse of the 15th chapter. Do you remember the part of the story where Israel has been in captivity as slaves, and there are about 1 million of them, and they're going to leave Egypt all at one time. They then find themselves with their backs against the Red Sea on one side and the galloping army of Pharaoh on the other. And having no hope, Moses raises his hands and the sea parts, and they go across on dry land. It's meant to remind anybody who knows the beginning of the Bible that God separated the dry land from the seas. And this is happening again. It's like the brand new creation, the birth of a new nation, the birth of Israel. And this is the celebration of Moses and Miriam. Listen for the word of God. Then Moses and the Israelites sang their song to the Lord. I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my might. He has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him. My father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he cast into the sea. His picked officers were sunk in the Red Sea. The floods covered them. They went down to the depths like a stone. Your hand, Lord, O Lord, glorious in power. Your right hand, O Lord, shattered the enemy. In the greatness of your majesty, you overthrow your adversaries. You sent them out with your fury. It consumed like stubble. At the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The floods stood up in a heap. The deeps congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My desire shall have its fill of them. I will draw my sword, my hand shall destroy them. You blew with your wind, the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in splendor, doing wonders? You stretched out your right hand, and the earth swallowed them. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Martin, I'm just wondering if you had a chance to do that scene, what it would look like. I think it would be magnificent. Would you join me at the front? Would you welcome Martin to the front? Good to have you here, sir.
I was going to say, remember that I do documentary films, not feature films.
Yeah, but this one's so problematic. I mean, the passage has, like, God's on a particular side, and it's just it makes for a really interesting conversation, which you're good at doing. You've been doing journey films for, since what, 1984? Mm-hmm. And you've done 30 films?
35.
35 films. On a lot of it having to do with issues of spirituality.
Yeah, really, essentially all of them, except from one. Yeah, all of them.
It's an amazing thing. So I wanted to talk to you about what you do and why you do it. Mm-hmm. So, where would you like? How would you like to start this?
Well, well, first of all, I want to say that I'm here as often as I can get here. I do travel a lot, and I just want to say both to you and to Jason and everybody here that this is a great congregation. I say that honestly to you. I think week in and week out that I get a chance to get here, I see inspired, thoughtful preaching, great music that goes on here. You've built a wonderful community within the community, and then that community is reaching out into the community, and I think that's the most important thing. So I have to say that you make good church here, and so I'm proud to be here and be part of this. And I saw the roster of people that you have coming over the next many weeks, and I'm honored to be with you. So. For me, I've been making documentary films now on topics of religion, faith, spirituality for over 30 years. And I did it because I felt as though that's a calling for me. I studied religion in college. I could never put the books down. I'm the kind of guy who used to, even in high school, I would read Letters and Papers from Prison by Dietrich Bonhoeffer and carry that with me onto the baseball field and carry it to the dugout. So when I wasn't batting, I was actually reading Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Letters and Papers from Prison. So I sort of caught the bug early on, and I never let it go.
That's fascinating. Your film on Dietrich Bonhoeffer is breathtaking, and you made him come alive through what you created. An incredibly important figure, and in some ways was lost without your film. There were books still around, but they had been somewhat lost, and the film revived the study of Bonhoeffer.
That's very kind. It almost didn't get made because I had been thinking about making the film on Bonhoeffer and sort of began to befriend some of the key people in the Bonhoeffer story, including Eberhard Bethge. If you know the Bonhoeffer story, it's probably because his very best friend, who actually did survive those times, was Eberhard Bethge, the person to whom Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote many of his most important letters. He sort of shared. He was his punching bag for theological arguments that he wanted to do. And Eberhard was the most wonderful character. I never obviously met Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I did get to know Eberhard Bethge.
Did you?
And he couldn't have been more gracious and welcoming. I remember so many times when we would visit him in Germany that there would be students waiting to get in to talk to Eberhard, to help him, to have them understand at a deeper level what Bonhoeffer meant about this passage, because they were seminarian students, they were writing some book or paper or something. And he was incredibly gracious, time-giving to everybody, but he afforded us days during the interview process to be with him. And I think it's Eberhard Bethge that really sort of made the reputation for Dietrich Bonhoeffer is as solid as it was. If you can imagine, Bonhoeffer dies in 1945 at the end of World War II.
He was a Lutheran pastor.
He was a Lutheran pastor.
Who became part of the resistance to Nazi Germany and was imprisoned because of it. Right. And ended up dying for his faith.
Right. And the last couple of years, it was Eberhard Bethge who would visit him in prison. Eberhard, too, actually had been conscripted. All the seminarians at that time had been conscripted by the Germans into the army, but Eberhard was able to get free and come into Berlin and see his good buddy Dietrich, and they would smuggle letters in and out so that Dietrich could actually keep up with what was going on outside, and that Eberhard could take what was the newest writings that Dietrich had and take them out and get them out and preserve them for posterity afterwards. And so it's because of Eberhard Bethge that the reputation, the name, the legacy of Dietrich Bonhoeffer is still known to most of us.
You just finished a film on Reinhold Niebuhr. You've been going all over the country, showing the film and being in lots of places and having a chance to talk about it. What fascinated you about Reinhold's life?
Well, I studied Reinhold Niebuhr in school. He was one of the people that I read about in college and liked him and thought he was important. And then, strangely enough, someone called me about a year and a half ago. Someone calls me up at night, found my number, calls me up. I'm not that hard to find. So they found me and called me up and said, hey, would you ever think of making a film about Reinhold Niebuhr? And I get a lot of calls. I get people who send me scripts and books and call me up and say, would you ever think about making a film about? And usually the about ends with saying, about me. My life is so incredible, you would have to make a film about my life. But this fellow actually called me up and said, I think you'd be the perfect guy to make a film on Reinhold Niebuhr. And I ran to the shelf, and I pulled the books off the shelf, and I said, let me think about this a little bit. And I agree. I just said, why did I miss this one? It was pretty self-evident. So I actually had the opportunity, we sort of made all the applications and started to rally the forces and everything to actually get the film made. And it's been a wonderful odyssey. It's been really interesting. I just came back, we showed the film at Harvard. I was invited to Harvard, and we did Princeton, and we did Fuller Theological Seminary. We did Notre Dame. I did Notre Dame. This week I was at a prison down in Virginia, a federal prison. So I'm actually presenting the film and talking about the themes of the film to federal inmates in the prison system. So it's got a storyline that talks about the good and evil in all of us, the notions of power, and that how we are supposed to, as human beings of faith, supposed to exercise that faith in the public spectrum. And I think Niebuhr was probably the best one in the 20th century for doing that. He was a public theologian par excellence in the 20th century whose legacy still continues to touch people like Barack Obama and John McCain, who still wants to talk about Reinhold Niebuhr. So you and I had a conversation about Niebuhr. He impacted you. I know that he had an impact on you. So he's a profoundly important character whose reputation will ebb and flow over the next many generations, but he's pretty popular right now, I have to say.
I think his writing about what it is to be Christian and a world that needs to shape policy in a particular way, and that the church has a role to play in the shaping of that policy that grows out of its religious convictions. So it's a fascinating guy. PBS has been showed it all over the summer. That's how I saw it and watched
And you didn't
it.
know it was my film.
I didn't know it was yours. When I knew you were working. I don't know. I didn't put it together. So, an absolutely fabulous thing. When you do a documentary, it isn't just a series of facts that you lay next to each other, but you create this incredible arc of a story.
Yeah. Stories. I think story is the fundamental point of it. I mean, it's theology. I love it, but I have to always remember that my task is to create a story that can play well nationally on public television for some people who may have some knowledge of a Reinhold Niebuhr, or Dietrich Bonhoeffer, whoever the story is about, and others who have no idea in the world what this is all about. And so, as they'll tell you in television, you have to catch them pretty quick, and you have to be able to be convincing with your argument as to why they should stay, because television today, like as you can imagine, people are literally sitting with the remote control, and if you don't get them in the first couple of minutes, you've lost them. So we've been very fortunate. Like I said, we've done 35 films now, and I'm learning with every film about how to do that. But I come to this with the understanding that I have an opportunity here now, a privilege to tell these kind of stories, to make these kind of films for a wider general audience, and then to take the films out and to engage audiences all across the country. It's a lot of fun. I have to say, it's still a lot of fun for me.
What's the most fun for you?
Well, I just love to have these kind of conversations. I mean, I love to go into environments where we can sort of show the films and talk about it, whether it's the power of forgiveness. I did 50 dates with the power of forgiveness all across the country.
Tell us about what's the story in the power.
The power of forgiveness was an idea that I came up with about just doing a series of short stories that would weave together in a tapestry to sort of take apart the notion of forgiveness. We're all, no matter what our faith traditions, and even those without faith, out of faith background, know something about forgiveness, but usually it's a very simplistic notion about what forgiveness is all about. And we started to peel that idea back a little deeper and deeper and deeper with the different stories that we did about the notions of self-forgiveness, about how important self-forgiveness is in the way that you look at the world around you, and your ability to forgive others really starts with your ability to forgive yourself. So there were stories in there about the Holocaust and the notion of how Jews might consider the forgiveness, even using the word forgiveness. And so I invited Elie Wiesel to be part of the film, and he was great, he was terrific. And we did a segment on the Amish, because after the incident that had happened up at the schoolhouse up in Lancaster County, where Charles Roberts went in and killed 6 of their young Amish students, the girls, the Amish community forgave him for having done that. I mean, it's unthinkable to be able to do that. It sets a bar that's almost unreasonably unattainable for most of us. But for me, that was one aspect, one storyline, where everybody else wanted to talk about how forgiveness is a process. You have to think about it. Don't give it unless you actually feel that sense of forgiveness, because that would be false. That would be like cheap grace, as Bonhoeffer talks about, would be cheap grace. On the other hand, the Amish, when given the opportunity, had a very simple formula. You know, Jesus Christ lived and died and forgave us for everything. We have to follow that formula. That prescription is very clear to us. So within 48 hours of losing a half a dozen of their own children in a merciless killing in the schoolhouse, they announced publicly that they're going to forgive Charles Roberts for what he had done. So that had to be one of the elements of the story. So it's each one of them had their own dimension to it. But I think, hopefully, I believe that as a whole, the film spoke to a topic that a lot of us believe in, but most of us want to stay away from when the rubber meets the road.
I'm happy with forgiving everybody except those who hurt me.
Yes.
That's kind of the way it works for me. So you're having fascinating conversations with people. I mean, like the idea of forgiveness, you're talking to people for whom that is the substance of their life, whether they are able to do that or not. And talking to the ones who find the courage to do it are fascinating human beings. What is it about this that is so interesting to you? Because you could do one of those and move on to something else, and you keep going back to the same well.
I guess. Yeah, I have to ask myself that sometimes too. I find it's a calling, and people seem confident and comfortable to talk to me about some of the things that are most painful in their lives. and where they're most vulnerable. I have to see that as a sacred trust. I have to start at that point, that this is a sacred trust. This is their story that they've given me. They've exposed themselves, and I have to be honorable, and I have to have integrity, and I have to have purpose for why I'm doing this. And if they can see that and believe that's true, and I don't disappoint them, then that will be okay. Everything from the prisoners, when prisoners want to sit down and talk to you about what it was, the reasons why they wound up, the failures in their own lives, why they wind up in prison, some of them for their entirety of their lives, they make themselves most vulnerable. Whether or not it's forgiving somebody else, they talk about how people have been weakened because of sometimes out of nowhere, a tragedy happens to them. They had no responsibility for it whatsoever, and yet they have to grapple with the notion of forgiveness. So for each one of us has to think about those things if we're called to faith, and yet each one of us has to believe that hopefully we'll have that kind of courage when the time comes for us. And we all wonder whether or not we will.
Don't you?
It's hard for me. You and I talked about that before. I have to say, I in some ways, I feel cowardly when I say that. I just feel as though I do my job the best I can and care deeply about these people. And then there are sometimes I'm wondering whether or not I could actually accomplish what they've accomplished in their lives. I hold myself accountable to that. So I can, in terms of journalism, a journalist can spend all day long answering the questions. Asking the questions, but in the end, you have to answer a few yourself.
Sometimes I find myself in the same kind of sacred space, that people, when they are in my office or I'm in their home, know that everything that's said there is private, that they can totally be themselves. They won't be exploited or used. I don't have another agenda except for to be kind, to be with them, to be present with them. And to just in the presence with someone is an awful lot of healing. But I also think that I have been exposed to some of the most courageous people in the world. And when my opportunity comes to be courageous, I'll have no excuse. Because I've had more examples in my life than almost anybody I know.
And you have those examples to draw on, and they give you they feed you the opportunity and the vision to do it. You just have to hope that you have the courage. Yeah. As Niebuhr, who wrote the Serenity Prayer, said, "Hope I have this, the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, and the courage to change the things I can."
And the wisdom to know the difference.
Wisdom to know the difference. It's that courage to change the things that I can. Mostly, that's about ourselves. Can I do it? Can I do it?
Is there something you're working on?
That whole notion of it?
Yeah.
Oh, sure. I'm working on it every day. The faith business is not an easy thing, And that's the other thing I have to say. I chose this path of doing films on religion, faith, and spirituality. People assume a lot, but it's a challenge every single day. In some ways, I'm always calling myself to dig a little bit deeper, to understand a little bit more, and understand what that means for me.
Do you have any new projects coming up that you could tell us about?
No. No, here's the basic formula. I'm about 3 weeks away from knowing if we'll get funding for a particular series of films that I want to do. And the early indication is yes, but I'm as superstitious as the next guy, so I tend not to talk about them because I don't want to create an expectation that if we don't get the funding, I can't do it. But we've gotten 33 films done by hook or by crook, some other way, and I'm confident that this series of films will happen. I'll probably do a series of biographical films in the short term, the next year or so, kind of like the Niebuhr film that we did. But there's and if we get the support of the foundations that we're asking for, which I hope we will get, then we'll be back doing that for the next year and a half or so.
Well, we can't wait to hear what it's going to be, what the topic's going to be. I know that you were very kind to bring some DVD copies of, what did you bring?
Niebuhr, the Reinhold Niebuhr film.
And we could buy that here?
You can buy that here, and I've donated them to the church, and so everybody who buys a copy actually is giving support to the church today. So we have Niebuhr there, and we have a couple of copies of the film on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and a couple of copies of the film on chaplains. So the film I did before Niebuhr was a film on chaplains, which was a multi-faith look at who chaplains are and why why they do what they do. I think it's an extraordinarily underappreciated ministry, form of ministry. And I think in part because of that, we've been able to sort of invigorate chaplaincy studies in a lot of different seminaries around the country. So I think there'll be more chaplains coming out in the next generation. I'm hopeful because they really do perform an extraordinary
that almost no one knows anything about. They're
No,
not like heroes who are going to be the front page of the paper.
They are, and we went to Afghanistan and filmed with the army chaplains in Afghanistan. I went to a prison and I found this incredible woman who was a Buddhist chaplain in a prison system out in Oregon, where they have the lowest rate of recidivism in America for the American prison systems, and partly that's because of this very effective chaplaincy program that they have. We did a Muslim chaplain in inner city Detroit who works with the police department in inner city Detroit. So PBS loved it because it was multi-faith. There's always a risk if you do one person or one faith tradition, you're at risk. But they liked it because it was multi-faith, and frankly they had a low threshold for understanding who chaplains were, and they were surprised. Most of the time, when I would ask people who chaplains are, if they have any recollection of what a chaplain is, what would you say? Probably the only chaplain most people know is Father Mulcahy from MASH, right? Right? And so when I would start asking people about who's the only chaplain you know, they'd say, well, I know Father Mulcahy from MASH. And so I decided not to fight that. But the smartest thing I could do was actually use that. So I went out and interviewed him. William Christopher, who's now since passed away, but I interviewed Bill Christopher, and let's talk about the role. And he said, I'm an actor. I played a role in a television series. He says, but I'd be in the grocery stores and people would ask me to baptize their babies. That's how much impact it had on him for generations. In some way too, he was a little resentful of it because he said he never really was able to accomplish a role again that had as much recognition and as an immediate impact as his role as Father Mulcahy. But he loved doing it. He just loved doing it.
So when you said that you doing these films on chaplains will have an impact on how many chaplains are serving, do you think about that?
Sure.
That next step, that what you choose to do a film about will have an impact, not just because people will think you're a great filmmaker, but will change lives on a deeper level than your own glory?
Well, there's no reason why you can't do all of that. A good story can incorporate all of that. We can make a good film, select topics that actually have that kind of longer sustained benefit. I must admit I do all the films in such a way that I hope that they'll sustain for 10, 15, 20 years, maybe a generation. I'm hopeful that these films will be around for a long period of time and that they'll continue to impact people. I want people to see a film on these chaplains, learn who they are, learn what they do, and consider the possibility of ministry and chaplaincy. I want people to know who Reinhold Niebuhr is, and I want people to know who Dietrich Bonhoeffer is and why they're important to us, not only historically as historical characters, not only as maybe hopefully a good story, but they actually can impact us now. So when I went out, I spoke in the prison, like I said this week. We talked about the notion of good and evil in all of us. That's Niebuhr's story. That's as timeless. That was Augustine. It was fundamentally St. Augustine who talked about that in the 5th century. So this is timeless stuff that he regenerated back in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s and became an American icon for doing that. He needs to be revisited, but these themes that he has are timeless, and hopefully people over the years will continue to look at these films and say that they have to think about this and consider these storylines.
Every time I talk to you, I'm fascinated and wish I could talk more. You're an
Are we already out of time?
We're out of time.
Okay.
Would you introduce us to your wife?
My wife is here. My wife is Yelena. Yelena, would you stand up? There you go.
Hi, Yelena.
Now, I just want to say what an incredible woman she is, because in addition to having her own enterprise that she's been doing now for many, many years very successfully, she's a tall blonde, I know that, but she's also got a PhD and an MBA. She's a real, and she thinks she's the lucky one. The truth of the matter is I'm really the lucky one. And she has seen that film, honey, would you say 50 times now, this Reinhold Niebuhr film? She every single night after night, she's been out there seeing that film. So thank you for that.
That's remarkable. It's an honor. We're thrilled to have you here. Thank you for coming. Would you thank Martin for being part of our guest tonight? Thank you,